Live now. Oh, we're live now, Sophie.
Afternoon, everyone. I can just see some people are trickling in still, so I'll give it a minute and then I will introduce today's speakers. I can see the numbers are increasing, so I'll start with the introduction and then we can get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Food for Thought seminar. I'm Sophie Watson from the Food for Thought team. Before we begin, just some housekeeping information. This seminar is being recorded. As this is a Teams live event, you can't unmute yourself or come on camera, but you can ask any questions on the Q&A section to the side and we'll cover these at the end. We're always looking for recommendations of speakers to invite, so if you do have any suggestions, then please let us know at our email address, which is foodforthought@food.gov.uk. And in terms of today, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Pantea Loftian and Dr. Bernard Strauss. Dr. Loftian is the founder and managing director of Camroche Limited, a technology and innovation strategy consultancy with a focus on the intersection between technology and policy design. She's worked over a decade with Fortune 100 and 500 companies, helping them develop and implement innovation strategy initiatives and investigate current and future technologies and markets. She's also a certified coach and works with executives, managers and teams on adapting to uncertainty with a focus on technology-driven change, and has considerable experience in mentoring and advising startups and SMEs for achieving growth. Pantea has a multidisciplinary background in science and technology with a PhD in biochemical engineering from UCL and an MPhil in technology policy from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Strauss is the co-founder and director of research at Camroche Limited. He designs research strategy, analysis solutions, and evidence-based decision-making frameworks for a broad range of technology innovation contexts. Bernard applies expertise from his past academic career in the biomedical sciences, cell and molecular biology and biochemistry to provide the science base for technology strategy and policy design at Camroche. Besides his past research contributions to the biomedical field and novel approaches to cancer research, he has developed a number of products for biomedical research applications and understands the technical and commercial requirements of the biotech innovation process. After undergraduate studies in biology and medicine in Austria, he obtained a PhD in molecular cell biology from the University of Cambridge. With that, I'll hand it over to our wonderful speakers to discuss the topic of potential changes in the UK food system over the next 10 years. So thank you, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, this is Bernard speaking. I just want to check, can everybody see my slides? Hello, Sophie, can you see my slides?
Yes,
very good.
Yep,
okay,
we can,
perfect.
Thank you.
Good, okay, thank you. So without further ado, I start talking about our recently published Food System Strategic Assessment 23, published by the FSA in early June. We're talking about the food system here, and I just thought it would be good just to remind us all a little bit what we are understanding by the food system and why it's important. So one of the many definitions could be that it's the sum of human activity and interactions within the natural and human-created environment that are essential for the production, processing, trading, selling, and the consumption of food. This is quite a mouthful, but we are just reminding ourselves that when we are talking about the food system as such, we are talking about a highly complex dynamic system with all the features of complex dynamic systems. For example, that they may have quite unexpected nonlinear responses. When you try to interfere with them, things are not as linear as one expects, and you create outcomes that you may not have foreseen. And there are potentials like emergent features that suddenly turn up, phenomena that you would never have been predicting from knowing just the basic boundary conditions. The reason it's important to think in a systemic manner is because we are increasingly getting better and better models of the food system, and we start understanding what is actually required to influence outcomes, desired outcomes. And that's where our view of the food system in the past decade or so has quite dramatically changed. when we think about the, say, past 50, 100 years, the main aim and desired output was really to feed as many people as possible, and with healthy and high quality food. Whereas now we are realizing all the negative impacts that the current food system has, not only on the planet, but also on human health. And the aim is now to look how we can influence the system to produce different outcomes and to transform the food system into one that has less negative impacts on human health and the planet. So this involves obviously the role of regulators when we are talking about the leverage points and who can transform the food system or can have an impact. And the question is, how can different regulators intervene or develop policies that will enable a new food system that has a little bit less negative impacts than the current one has. And with respect to FSA remit areas, these are to make sure that this food we consume is safe and that it's authentic. And now with these new focus areas of health and sustainability in mind, the question arises, how can these remit areas be leveraged to help transform the food system towards a different value model that incorporates a different perspective of what the food system should achieve. And hence, to do that, you need strategy, and hence there was a strategic assessment and many before, and this sort of exercises are carried out worldwide with similar aims in the recent past. So we have done the FSA Food System Assessment 2023, and I just briefly tell you how we did that. It was mainly based on a survey among experts across the food system, and followed this up by a subset of highly detailed interviews. We then had a workshop where we then again drilled deeper in some of the issues that were identified. And overall, we had input from 93 experts, and this was accompanied by literature research to fill in gaps and get other data in where we had not so much detail. As you can see, we have had a quite good spread internationally and nationally. So it was 54 UK participants and 30 other nationalities in the survey, and a good mix across European and non-European countries. With respect to the expertise that these participants had, we had quite a good range, again, with obviously a strong focus on food safety and food fraud, but also a lot of people in sustainability, technology and innovation, risk mitigation and so on, agriculture production, to make sure that we get a fairly complete overview of what people think is going on in the current food system in terms of trends and developments. Also sectors, it's quite important to get a good cross-section through the food system, and we have a good range from industry this time, fairly good proportion of industry participants, trade associations, consumer associations involved in international organizations like the governments and FAO and United Nations, etc. So get a good overview of what widely a range of people think are the major pressing issues at the moment in the food system. And when I say at the moment, it was the context of January to March 2023. And these experts prioritized quite a good number of really high important issues at that point of time. We should not forget the sort of geopolitical and general context. So if you think back half a year, there was still a lot of post-COVID effects, quite recognizable, extremely high energy prices going on for a year at that point, high inflation and consumer price inflation, Ukraine war, geopolitical tensions, of course, increasing, and all the Brexit consequences looming large. And that has generally prompted or has generally led to a perception by all these contacted experts that there is really a time of great uncertainty at the moment that requires solutions with high urgency. And most of the issues raised were felt to be really short, medium-term impact and required systemic solutions, because a lot of them have very interconnected and systemic impacts. And some of these were, of course, to do with Brexit. We go into that a little bit later, but then aspects like labor shortages, cost of living crisis, then the weak position of the SMEs in a weak economic environment, novel foods regulation were mentioned, increasing cost of innovation, etc., etc. And these issues were then broken down into specific drivers, and we went along this route to structure that report, where we associated the issues that were raised with the most likely and main overarching driver. And then we had these main 6 drivers that we were looking at, and we all know that drivers interact, they're systemic, they're complex, etc. But this was a good way of sorting through the issues that were raised. And we are talking about UK economic condition, the consumer attitudes, commercial drivers, basically commercial decision-making drivers, technology innovation, climate change and environment issues, and the issues around Brexit and regulatory change. So these 6 drivers were used to then categorize what was found by our experts. And I will now do a quick run through just some points underneath each of these drivers to give you an illustration what is in the report, so that you can see, get interested in some, look for some details yourself, or then have an in-depth look at something that's interesting in you. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we cover what's in there, but it will be a very brief touching only on certain aspects. Starting with what we call the UK economic condition driver, in this first trend or issue, influenced mainly by geopolitics, with a high impact expected to last in the short and medium term. And that was supply chain volatility or supply chain disruptions. And we got a good insight into that because we, as I said before, we had a reasonably good proportion of industry representatives who were quite concerned about this, and let us know how deeply that affects and how long-term this affects a number of decision-making processes in the food industry. So I just raised some points there. So if you suddenly, through, say, in this case, the Ukraine war or some post-COVID effects, ingredients or inputs into your products are not available on the market anymore, then all of your process has to stop at some point, or has to be replaced, or you have to replace inputs from somewhere else that you have not sourced them before. And there's an additional type of input that can have very systemic effects, which are systemic inputs, say, for example, like fertilizers or CO2 that affects many industries at the same time. And we had all these shortages experienced in the past year. And industry experts then told us how they have then to very rapidly reallocate a lot of resource and investments to cope with this uncertainty and the inability to source from trusted suppliers. It means building new supply routes. Each of these decisions requires then testing and auditing new suppliers and making sure that the standards and safety requirements are met, which is extra cost that had to be paid. And obviously SMEs being most affected by such volatility. And then one figure that just popped out was that because of these disruptions at the moment, and we were talking here early in 23, about £3 billion worth of goods and foods were in temporary storage awaiting finishing, simply because one of the ingredients was missing. And a lot of the industry experts said that, well, that will be the new normal for the foreseeable future. They were not expecting a sort of stable supply chain situation in the near future. All of this, of course, raises questions whether this tension and pressures that industry food producers are exposed to will lead in the long term to food safety and authenticity issues, which haven't been detected at this point, but may arise in the near future due to these pressures. So supply chain volatility and disruption, a major impact over the next 2 to 5 years potentially. Then another issue around UK economic conditions driven by all sorts of economic factors, inflation, high energy prices, etc. We all know this from the media, is household food insecurity in the UK is rising, and it will be doing so most likely in the short, medium term and will continue. And food insecurity, as defined by the FAO, is when somebody lacks regular access to enough safe and nutritious food for normal growth and development and an active and healthy life. And of course, this issue was picked up by the FSA earlier and other institutions. And one of the quotes from a report from last year was by one of these reports by the FSA saying food affordability and food insecurity is currently the most important aspect in consumer decision making and the way people think and feel about food. And this is still the case. So though we were working early in 23, looking into March 23 data, and I checked later on in April again, there is now about 20% of households across England, Wales and Northern Ireland that are food insecure, which was a 5% increase from the previous year. And it affects more than 4 million children. And of course, this raises all sorts of social issues, a lot of questions how policy making could help improve access to food. And of course, we all know this is not a single department's remit to solve this problem, but there are longer term trends that will affect the food system because we have these social and other issues that cause people to be food insecure. This is clearly documented by an increase in food bank use, which is not a recent phenomenon. Food bank use is rising for the past decade at least. There are studies going back to 2010, and since then we have every year an uptick in food bank use. And this is still the case. And one issue linked with that is obviously what are the long-term health outcomes of this situation where people are food insecure and eat possibly less lower quality food and for a long period of time, etc. And if health is part of the food system goals, then we need to look into this in some shape or form. This food bank data is just backed up by data after the report was published. So the Trussell Trust food bank charity then shows here, for example, that they had to dish out the highest number of emergency food parcels ever in early 23, which was more than double the amount 5 years ago. And the fact that food bank users have to, or food insecure households have to cut down on healthy food is documented on the right side by some data from the Food Foundation from end of last year. So people can't afford healthy food in a food insecure situation. Another driver that was quite concerning for a lot of people, especially in industry, was the fact that labor shortages have been increasing, not only due to the fact that COVID and Brexit have reduced labor in agriculture, what we have heard about quite a bit about. But in general, in the food system at the moment, there is a strongly felt shortage of all kinds of labor, not only low, but also high-skilled labor, driven not only by Brexit and wave of early retirements, but also longer-term systemic issues. Where do we get the people trained? Do we have enough training facilities? Do we have enough courses? Do we have high-skilled labor incentivized enough to go into these careers, etc., etc. And these labor shortage areas, they affect to a large degree, or could affect to a large degree, food safety and quality issues. And as it affects abattoir workers, butchers, veterinarians, border control staff, environmental health officers, trading standards officers, meat hygiene inspectors, and of course lorry drivers and warehouse workers. But across this range, all of this could lead to stress and tension in the system if this stuff is not available, and may impact food safety, quality, authenticity in the long run. And these systemic issues, to address these, are quite unclear how they and when they will resolve. So this was a strong concern for many in food production, processing, and of course within agencies maintaining food standards. I'm just quickly mentioning a few aspects about consumer attitudes. A driver always to be considered when you look into long-term trends, how food consumptions may change. Consumer attitudes are at the moment considered by many people as quite volatile and introducing difficulties in actually messaging to consumers, and also difficulties in predicting consumer behavior. And that will remain the case, at least in the short, medium term, next 2, 3, 4 years. And this affects clearly trends that we have read about in the media, where there is quite a perception that everybody wants healthy food, many people will move towards plant-based and meat alternative foods. But all of that is now strongly impacted by the cost of living situation, where anything that's above average pricing will be probably not selected so easily. Which is also documented, and is a mixture between a change in consumer behavior and commercial factors, is the fact that a lot of plant-based companies and products have failed in the recent year and a half. There was a peak in investment throughout COVID, and a lot of these products haven't really met expectations of consumers. And there is also this increasing information about these products, and there might be an attitude change around the corner where consumers start seeing these products like plant-based or meat substitutes or even cultured meat in a different light. They're increasingly seen as highly processed, and what is also not so clear for consumers, or where there is actually a scientific measuring scale lacking, is anything to do with the sustainability claims of such products. A lot of meat alternatives usually are claimed to have benefits for the environment, and many of those do. But in terms of measuring that, it's a very long way to go. And in terms of the messaging towards increase of sustainability, it's also clear that consumers need a lot more information about this. For example, 50% of consumers didn't know that the impact of meat on the environment, that this is actually a negative impact food type. And it's clear that consumer messaging needs to be a lot clearer, and potentially need to increase in the next 2 or 3 years to make sure that consumers can make the right decisions even in economically difficult times. Moving on to some commercial drivers, where we are talking about commercial decision making mainly. And what came out, and I just very quickly mentioned this as a concern of industry, as something industry is affected by at the moment, producers, manufacturers, processors, and even some aspects of packaging and retail. And they're telling us that due to high input costs at the moment across the board, and disrupted supply chains, and regulatory and Brexit uncertainties, many companies, they have just to cut back on investing into innovation, into new technologies, into upgrades, into more risky product development, etc. And that may affect in the long term, or in the medium to midterm, in the short to midterm, how companies think about investments, for example, into technologies to increase sustainability and to produce products that have higher health and sort of innovative features that could be desirable to develop, but they wouldn't allocate resources at this point in time. So investment into innovation at the moment held back by various economic pressures. I will just quickly brush over the technology innovation that was considered of high importance for transforming the food system. So generally in the food sector, there is always the lookout for the next big technology that may change and transform the food system, reduce its negative impacts on the planet and on human health. And these listed technology areas that I show here, so improved agricultural production, digital, AI and robotics, alternative sources of protein, novel food processing technologies, gene editing, insects in food and feed, and improved packaging. All of these areas were considered of high importance, that they need to progress to improve the food system. But what I will do now is I will just highlight a few findings in all of this innovation space that are probably unexpected or that give a bit of a deeper insight in how these innovations might progress in the short to midterm future. So improved agricultural production technologies. There were a number mentioned by our experts, from precision agriculture, regenerative agriculture, integrated pest management, high-tech horticultural production, glass houses, indoor farming and vertical farming. Clearly, a lot of those not much to do with FSA remit, but as it's highly reported in the media, we had to discover that high-tech horticultural production, all these glass houses and all the vertical farms where you see plants in factories-like settings growing under spooky UV light, without any, in a completely closed setting, fully controlled environment. Where it's always reported and thought that these solutions, also including very high-tech glass houses, where you have something like 20 hectares under a fully controlled environment with a massive energy input, and sort of producing every day a few 10 tons of cucumbers, for example. These technologies were always considered to contribute to the future UK food supply increasingly. They're local, you could say. They have no carbon footprint in terms of importing it from other parts of the world, etc., etc. And they were considered to enable a lot of improved plants as well, where you could then have better plants in a kind of almost locally sourced situation, support the market. But turns out these are in a crisis at the moment for at least the last 2 or 3 years. It's a contracting sector, in fact, and it's at the moment, because of high energy costs, very unclear how they will contribute in the future to the UK markets. A lot of closures also across Europe, and the economics of energy input and price are still not working out well. Another example area that I just pick up in the technology innovation space that we read a lot about is digital, AI and robotics. And robotics, for example, in the agricultural sector, still a long way off for harvesting, for example. But I say here just a general point about digital AI robotics, which is that food and drinks manufacturing as a whole, as an industry, seems to be lagging behind other industries in updating, digitizing, and reaping the benefits of these. And though at the moment the efficiencies and resource use are clearly can be reduced with these, can be increased with these technologies. At the moment, as I mentioned before, investments in companies will clearly go to the more established, safer technologies where they don't need to risk introducing something into the company that might fail or might cause more costs, etc., etc. So it will be held back further in the near to midterm future, potentially. And the only area where digital is still driving novel innovation is the space around online consumer food system interactions. And that's still going on at pace, simply because it doesn't involve that high capital investments initially. And we have published this early in our work on digital platforms in the food sector, where we just show here that consumers are increasingly interacting with the value chain in the food system in different ways. It's not linear anymore. Consumers can directly access many players in the food system, and they can do that in various changing ways. And novel food safety and authenticity issues arise, of course, because this online digital interaction space is very difficult to monitor and to enforce and police. And hence, different types of risks may emerge through these interactions for consumers. And therefore, also FSA has been started engaging, for example, with platform providers. One of the technology space that will continue to change the way how consumers interact with the food system for the near, mid to long-term future. In another part of technology innovation that is much in the media, and we can now look back on some kind of achievement in that area, that's gene editing, precision breeding technologies. Precision Breeding Act has been passed in March this year. And in general, the view of consumers and regulators is increasingly positive, also in the EU, moving towards similar concepts as in the UK and legislation. It's considered safe for humans, gene-edited foods and food products. But we have to say that scientific complexities are still high, IP issues remain, and the potential to create traits of animals and plants that should, for example, address environmental pressures, water uptake, pest resistance, etc., need to be seen in larger trials and field trials that may take a long time to bring such agricultural products to the markets. And the potential to contribute in a meaningful way and in a large scale to our food system is probably still a while off, according to our experts. Given that we have the Precision Breeding Act now passed, experts basically expect that products and foods and feed may reach the UK within the next 2-3 years at scale. But then until we can produce gene-edited products, feed, food in the UK and contribute to our own market, that may still take another decade or so. If we consider the importance of how consumers perceive gene technology, UK consumers in 23 were mostly not informed about this, what it is, didn't quite understand the concept of gene editing. The difference between genetically modified and edited was not very clear. And about a third simply reject the technology. But after informing the uninformed consumers what it is and how it works, etc., half of them would support this type of technology, which is important because once it comes to issues like labeling and where the consumers need to have informed decision-making powers, then it will be quite important how you message what this technology actually is and what it can deliver to the consumers in an appropriate manner to unleash the potential that it can have. Moving on to insects and food as an example, it's quite clear that we read a lot about this. The environmental benefits are clear. It reduces feed inputs into per unit protein by half compared to chicken, or by 1/6 compared to cattle. The insects produce much less greenhouse gases, and a lot of insect protein products are tested in small test markets and are now rolled out in smaller markets. Feed for pet feed and pet feed are quite well established. And also human consumption markets are established. And in the EU, consumption for humans, insects for human consumption and for feed are now permitted, which in the UK still is not the case. We need to still update some regulation in the novel food regulation to get there. But despite the clear environmental impacts, the positive impact it would have, for example, substituting animal feed proteins such as soy at scale, it may still take a while, and we are talking probably quite the mid to long-term future, as it's still expensive on the whole, and production is growing rather slowly globally, and it's still a market size only between 50 to 500 million globally, and the growth rate is very low as it seems, and hence, even though a lot of reporting, a lot of interest, it may be a while off. I will not go into climate change, long-term issues, mostly not directly posing any novel threats to safety and authenticity. To the end, just a quick brush through Brexit and regulatory change as a driver of change in the UK food system. A lot of survey participants had grave concerns about any number of impacts that come from uncertainty, mainly uncertainty that's due to regulatory situations that are unpredictable to do with Brexit over the next 5 years. To do with border enforcement, for example, there is concern that there's current staff and skills shortages will lead to difficulties, which will also lead to increased costs for companies to navigate. And in the end, there might arise safety and authenticity issues simply to an overstretched system when it has to work with full border controls enforced. New trade agreements as a result of Brexit need to consider what food system values are desired in the UK and what long-term policies need to be decided on. Regulatory divergence, a big issue for producers, food industry in general. Is it worth producing different products for different divergingly regulated markets? Obviously to do with novel foods regulation, additives, chemicals, and labeling around sustainability and health. A lot of uncertainty there. A lot of industry proponents were also concerned about, and also regulators and government departments, how the retained EU law and reform bill work in the civil service will actually distract and deprioritize ongoing work that is quite important for the food system. And in the end, as it's also linked to Brexit, a lot of people were always wondering about the benefits, about the potential opportunities that a EU independent regulatory system may offer. And our respondents suggested some of these ones, where they said it will lead to greater independence in regulation, would probably lead to more domestic food production. We could reduce the length of some supply routes. We could have better environmental protection. We could have better public education on sustainable consumption, have our own better labeling, for example. We could go independent and lead in agri-tech innovation, etc. Now having the precision breeding bill through government. And yes, have better technologies to support increased plant-based food production, and so on and so forth. All of these opportunities obviously need solutions to systemic issues that are currently challenges to the system. And just to conclude now, I would say all of these issues and concerns that are currently affecting for the next 2 to 5 years, potentially the UK food systems, they have a few things in common. They're mostly challenges, mostly of a systemic nature, and they also need systemic solutions to be able to build a better food system if we want that. And of course, to do that, that requires really long-term vision and leadership. What is the better food system that we want to build? What are the components, the outcomes? This can only be done through clearly cross-departmental and international collaborations. And clearly it requires that we implement some of the long-term values that we all may agree on. And these are also including food safety, authenticity, health, sustainability, and more equal access to food. And in these areas, FSA remit may find ways to support the restructuring and transformation of the food system. I think I'll leave it here and hand over to our moderator, and we can start our questions and answers.
Thanks, Bernard. Pantea, were you coming in, or is that the end of the presentation?
This is the end of the presentation, so we can, yeah. Okay,
perfect. Thank you so much for the really interesting presentation. It's some very topical and important issues, obviously, for everyone to have a think about, and how it affects the food system and the work that we do at the FSA. I just wanted to apologise for a few technical difficulties at the start. I know a few people were affected and couldn't get in at first, but just to mention that this recording will be circulated if you missed the beginning. In terms of some questions, we've had a couple through in the chat. One of them was around whether there was a link to the report. So that's now being posted in the chat if you'd like to have a look at that from the FSA website. I was particularly interested.
Can I just quickly add something to this link? Ideally, if you go to the PDF link, it gives you the straight report. Otherwise, you get a sort of chaptered version. If you look for the PDF link, that would be the one to go for.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We can circulate that around after as well. I was going to say I was particularly interested in the food insecurity driver, and we've recently published just today our Food and U2 Wave 6 publication. So that's just shown rising levels of food insecurity reaching now 25% compared to 16% in 2020. So definitely something to keep an eye on. I also just had one question before I look in the Q&A, which was around the technology innovation. So you talked about the importance of digital technologies, AI and robotics. I was just wondering if you can give an example of how AI is being used or might be used in the food industry.
Yeah, so the AI aspect in the food industry is quite often apart, say, from marketing and having consumer interaction, tracking and anything to do with marketing. There is a clear need, or a clear application area in the manufacturing and processing industry, where it is all about improving, say, engineering processes and production processes. There is predictive analytics going on in machines, in factory floors. And it's online real-time monitoring of what is going on, pattern detection, the type of sensors that are used in the food industry. They will all be linked up to some AI analytics to improve processes, reduce resource use, etc. But one shouldn't forget, I mean, it requires a lot of more investment, I should say, than one thinks. It's estimated that AI investments are only about, in terms of costs, the actual AI element is only about 10% of costs. And all the rest of it will be how to implement that into hardware, how to implement this into processes, how to change processes on the factory floor, in the feedbacks, for example, between supply chain and the factory floor, which is directly linked. In pattern recognition will be increasing efficiencies a lot there. But one should not forget, AI is a small proportion of the investment. So somebody who does that at scale will still have to invest a lot more in high capital elements of production processes.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for that. So I can see a few questions coming in now, just trickling through. So I'll read out the first one that came in. So how are the findings from this project being communicated with other government departments and key stakeholders? They align very much with FSA's remit, but others are also likely to be interested.
Yeah, as far as we know, so we have, so obviously we know how FSA disseminates. We have done a little bit of our own dissemination. But otherwise, I must say I'm not informed how this is spreading across departments. I don't really know.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. I've got another question here. So it says, you mentioned that when informed, 50% of consumers support GE/PB, so gene editing, precision breeding. Does that mean that 50% did not support? And if that's the case, including those that already reject the technology, do you estimate over half of the UK not support the use of genetic editing or precision breeding?
Yeah, I should say here, so this was an FSA study done last year, and the way they approached this these numbers is the following. So they first asked people, do you know anything about precision breeding? And then 75% of people said no. Then 29% of people said they would reject it. Yeah. And then they informed people who didn't know what it is and what are the strengths and weaknesses, etc. What's the science behind this? And after having received this information, then 50% would say, okay, I'm okay with it and I would support it. But we have to say this is a small sample, but we need to see what happens once an actual market appears. Then the situation might be quite different, and people want to be informed and then want to have labeling. They want to make informed decisions, and that can be pushed by some consumer interest groups. And once we are into that, the consumer wants to know whether it is gene edited, yes, no, then this opens up a whole kind of worms that need to be addressed in one way or another. But in general, it's in the UK in general may be more tolerant, the UK consumers, than, for example, many other European countries. We know that for sure. The rejection rate might be a lot higher in Germany, and say the Spanish are quite actually tolerant and perceptive for that. But the UK numbers came up the way I explained. It was 50% once they got the information.
Thanks for the clarification there. And just an add-on there, someone asked as part of the same question, does age influence acceptance? Are younger consumers more or less likely to accept GE and PB?
I don't have seen an age breakdown there, I have to say. I can't say anything about this, really.
No worries. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. The conclusions don't seem specific to the project scope, and there was a lot covered in the talk. What are the project's conclusions about the most important changes to the UK food system that fall within the FSA's remit and how they affect its strategic priorities?
Can I take that one? Is it okay?
Yeah.
I must say that I can see that the project actually came up, obviously, as said there, with really a large and broad sort of systemic drivers and looking at them and how these trends are impacting. And obviously, in 40 minutes, the lot of conclusion, also recommendations that would be a separate presentation. What I can say is that the workshop, particularly the workshop part of the project that we did, was really focused on looking into and working with the experts to we brought the data and what we have seen in the survey and heard through depth interviews to the experts that were present at the workshop, including a number of industry representatives there. It was really a very good mix, that workshop, of the breakdown of the backgrounds you saw. And in that workshop, actually, we came out with the long list of how do experts respond to the findings, and where they see solutions may lie, recommendations may lie. And in summary, really what we said there is a very sort of extracted summary of those recommendations that were also put forward, which is one has to really start with accepting that this is a systemic issue, and just sort of one-off unit of action may alleviate some pain now or in a short run, but in order to stabilize it, and actually I would say prepare the food system for a changing world which is facing climate change and also increasing geopolitical volatility, there has to be fundamental systemic decisions to be made, and that requires the leadership and also setting the values that you want to go for in building that sort of strengthened system. So that I would leave it at that, because otherwise it's going into a large list of details, I would say.
Yeah, okay. Just if you want to get some sort of pointers towards FSA remit details, I would say one of the big pressures felt was really also the capacity issues around skilled labor, how to actually in the near future will we be able to maintain food safety standards and authenticity standards, simply due to the pressures through all sorts of economic and other factors that strain the system that does the enforcement and the maintaining. And this is an internal, if you want, issue almost, but it needs to be addressed through a range of measures to do, for example, with education. Do we have enough training courses? Do we have enough facilities? We have for many years now, for decades, relied on EU capacity to do testing, for example. How can we replace this with UK capacity, etc.? So that was one big concern to do with how capacity issues, labor shortage issues have an impact. And I would say generally to anything to do with Brexit uncertainty is another issue where as a regulator one could see how can we work better, quicker on issues like, for example, novel food legislation, etc., to make sure that a large proportion of industry can respond in a predictable way and not wait and delay decision making. That was just two aspects of it.
Thank you both. That's really useful. Just to also flag in relation to the previous question, Michelle has commented, and Greg in the chat as well, for more information on consumer acceptance on precision breeding to speak to social science team, especially Laura Broomfield. And Greg has also highlighted that he can provide more information as the Strategic Insights team commission the research. So he's just mentioned in the chat, obviously the report has been published and shared with counterparts in other government departments, but we'll be looking at a more proactive rollout of the report. So watch this space. One final, sorry, Bernard, do you want to come in?
No, because it just links up in terms of what to do, and it's and how this links up with FSA remit, how these potential changes and issues link up to FSA remit. One point that was also highlighted quite a bit by respondents to the survey and interviews was the fact that potentially FSA could play a more proactive role in communicating certain issues around, say, for example, precision breeding, and around sustainability, which requires then also working on measures for sustainability of food items, etc., labeling systems, and so on and so forth, and engaging more as a food standards regulator with broader issues in terms of bringing information to consumers and industry as well. Industry would like more interaction. In fact, that's what we heard as well.
Great, thank you. So we have time just for one more question. So there's one more in the chat, which was there anything that came through from the experts that surprised you?
That's it. That's an interesting question. I would say, I think probably me and Bernard, let's answer it differently maybe. I would say in general, no, because when you start the research and read, you get a feel for where the world is going. But for me, the surprising probably point was where their focus and attention at the moment in that snapshot of time we were doing the research was. And really a lot of emphasis was on uncertainty. And I would say uncertainty is not going to go away. In some areas, it may have been alleviated as the months have gone by, but it has not gone away. And potentially new uncertainties would arise in a world that currently we see. So if I was taking a message from what surprised me is actually preparing for responding to uncertainty, which it goes back to that systemic sort of preparedness, because to react to and respond to uncertainty, you can't have a linear approach, and that is something, it was palpable that uncertainty was the main issue when we did the research.
Yeah, I would add, for me, there were things like that industry, for example, really would say, well, we hold off with innovation. We have to deal with this now. That's something I was not expecting or thinking they would be pushing forward in terms of hoping to make bigger gains with innovation to compensate. But this commitment to actually to sort out these commercial issues first to that extent was quite unexpected. And the second thing for me that I was not really expecting had to do with, I mean, the whole, how should I say, food insecurity issue. I did not expect that scale to continue on. I was thinking, well, now we are easing off out of COVID, etc., and that it is still such a big issue that I was a little bit shocked, I have to say.
Yeah, definitely agree on the food insecurity. It's something we've been tracking for a while, but the latest results have just kind of demonstrated that even further. So thank you both so much. I haven't got any more questions that have come in. There's another comment from Greg. So those of you who had some questions around the sort of commissioning of the research and communication, then please just take a look at Greg's comments. So thank you, Greg, for coming in there. So I think we'll wrap it up now. But thank you both so much for attending. And if anyone else has any questions, please just let the Food for Thought team know, and we can circulate those along with the recording via email. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll end the live event there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.